She was the quiet force behind the company's transformation. When she joined, the firm was struggling to compete in a market obsessed with innovation. Its properties looked outdated, its reputation was fading, and even loyal clients were starting to glance at competitors. She didn't arrive with grand speeches or dramatic promises. She arrived with sketches, models, and a mind that saw possibilities where others saw expenses. Within months, abandoned projects became showcases of modern architecture. She redesigned lobby spaces that attracted luxury tenants and turned forgotten rooftops into penthouses worth headlines. Investors stopped asking why they should trust the company and began asking how soon they could buy in. Each success carried her signature. The curved glass facade everyone photographed at night? Her idea. The sustainable structures praised in national design journals? Her work. The CEO enjoyed the spotlight and took credit effortlessly, but he never asked how those ideas were born or who protected the company from architectural irrelevance. He assumed brilliance was a department, not a person. So while she worked late nights redrafting plans to meet impossible deadlines, he believed her contributions were replaceable. The dismissal arrived like a power outage in the middle of a performance. He entered her office without knocking, wearing the half-smile of a man convinced of his own importance. He spoke slowly, as if delivering wisdom rather than betrayal. The words felt absurd. We need someone more aligned with the company's vision. As if she hadn't created that vision brick by brick. He didn't reference her achievements, didn't acknowledge the revenue spikes tied to her projects, didn't mention the city award the firm received because of her designs. He simply handed her a cardboard box, as though packing 7 years of architecture could be done between breaths. She looked at the walls one last time. Walls she had chosen, measured, and reshaped. Every detail, from the lighting to the acoustics, had been intentional. The irony burned. The man firing her didn't understand the difference between building ownership and structural dependency. He believed titles granted security. She knew foundations granted survival. When she stepped out of the building, she wasn't leaving a job. She was walking away from a structure that no longer understood what held it upright. He thought he was cutting costs. In reality, he was removing the blueprint that made his empire possible. And buildings without blueprints eventually collapse, not suddenly, but inevitably. Her departure barely cooled before her replacement arrived. His entrance was theatrical, as though confidence were a substitute for competence. He spoke quickly, smiled often, and recited phrases designed to sound visionary. His resume overflowed with trendy terminology, urban futurism, experiential elevation, immersive workspace philosophy. Yet when asked about structural load calculations or zoning restrictions, he smiled wider and changed the subject. He treated architecture like branding, not engineering. The CEO was enthralled. He paraded the newcomer through boardrooms and construction sites, praising him as the future of the company. He mistook charisma for qualification and vocabulary for mastery. Clients who once felt reassured by meticulous planning were now handed mood boards and slogans. Drawings were replaced with digital mock-ups that looked impressive until an engineer pointed out they couldn't be built. Soon, the consequences showed. Contractors requested clarifications the newcomer couldn't provide. He approved glass walls without considering sunlight exposure, resulting in unbearable heat and increased energy costs. He forgot emergency exits on a commercial floor plan, forcing costly redesigns. Each flaw required time, money, and apologies, none of which he offered. He blamed suppliers, weather, and outdated regulations. The CEO defended him at every turn, insisting these mistakes were signs of creative disruption. Clients who once praised the company's precision grew uneasy. They questioned delays, demanded revisions, and whispered doubts. One high-profile investor canceled a project after a disastrous presentation where the new recruit confused the structural core of a skyscraper with decorative columns. Another threatened litigation when promised materials didn't meet basic compliance standards. The once flawless reputation she had crafted began to fracture, one irresponsible decision at a time. She learned of these failures through former colleagues and industry murmurs. She did not celebrate. She didn't stock updates or hope for collapse. Her understanding was calmer, almost clinical. When foundations are ignored, failure isn't a question, it's a timeline. She had always designed with permanence in mind. The newcomer designed with buzzwords. The CEO believed he had hired ambition. What he actually hired was erosion. The architect knew that buildings reveal truth eventually. Walls crack where arrogance hides. Ceilings sag where shortcuts live. And sooner or later, even a CEO intoxicated by praise must face the reality no vocabulary can disguise. Structures don't bend to ego. They expose it. The unraveling did not begin with whispers behind closed doors. It erupted in daylight, under the scrutiny of inspectors, investors, and city officials who expected excellence and found negligence. The company's flagship development, a gleaming commercial complex meant to symbolize its dominance, became the epicenter of humiliation. What was supposed to be the CEO's legacy project quickly transformed into a cautionary tale. On inspection day, engineers stood in silence as they reviewed the structural plans. Support beams meant to carry 6 floors of weight were misaligned by several degrees, threatening long-term instability. Corridor widths violated emergency access standards. Electrical routing ignored basic fire safety protocols, creating hazards that could bankrupt the firm if a single spark found a wire. The project, once celebrated in press releases, now resembled a rushed student assignment patched with excuses. The cost of repairs was staggering. Contractors halted progress until new approvals were obtained. Materials had to be reordered, labor rescheduled, and expertise rehired. What was initially budgeted at 50 million surged toward 100, without a single tenant willing to move in. Investors who once toasted to the company's brilliance now demanded explanations delivered without adjectives or slogans. There were no inspirational quotes capable of repairing a building that couldn't stand. The CEO panicked. He called emergency meetings, barked orders, and pointed fingers at departments that had once thrived under competent leadership. He blamed supply chain delays, regulatory changes, and even the creative freedom he had encouraged. Everyone recognized the truth he refused to articulate. He had replaced a master builder with a marketer who couldn't distinguish a foundation from a facade. The board members grew restless. Their polished calm cracked as they faced the possibility of lawsuits, penalties, and evaporating credibility. Some recalled the woman who once anticipated problems before they existed, who questioned dimensions others ignored, who insisted that every detail supported the whole. The CEO remembered her too, not with nostalgia, but with a tightening in his chest he mistook for stress. It was regret, rare and unwelcomed. The crisis wasn't just structural. It was reputational. Clients stopped returning calls. Partners reconsidered alliances. The kingdom he assumed was permanent now trembled under its own arrogance. The CEO finally understood something he dismissed too late. Talent isn't expensive. Replacing it is. There comes a moment in every downfall when the noise of excuses finally quiets, leaving only truth ringing in the air. For the CEO, that moment arrived on a Tuesday morning, long before the company lights flickered on. He sat in his office, surrounded by architectural plans he didn't understand and numbers he could no longer manipulate into optimism. Meetings with the board had turned combative. Investors were losing patience. Headlines were questioning how a once-respected firm had managed to sabotage its own legacy. And every path forward led to a single name, the architect he had dismissed with a cardboard box. He hesitated before dialing her number. His fingers hovered as though pressing the digits required admitting weakness. For years, he believed leadership meant never showing uncertainty. Now uncertainty was the only thing he possessed in abundance. He cleared his throat and pressed call, expecting she would either ignore him or answer eagerly. He prepared for one of those outcomes. He didn't prepare for what actually happened. Her voice was calm, measured, the exact opposite of the storm inside him. She didn't sound resentful. She didn't sound eager. She sounded occupied, as though the world had moved on without him, and she had moved with it. He introduced himself clumsily, a man suddenly aware of how small authority becomes once its foundation erodes. He tried to sound confident, but professionalism cracked under the weight of desperation. His greeting dissolved into the rawness he had worked so hard to hide. "We need you back," he blurted, skipping every grace note etiquette required. "The board wants a full redesign. If we don't deliver, we risk losing everything. Name your price." The silence that followed was not empty. It was precise, like an expertly placed beam holding the weight of the moment.
She didn't gasp.
She didn't feign surprise. Her pause forced him to hear something he had never acknowledged. His empire had been built on her competence, not his ambition. Time, not her, was dismantling his pride. He expected relief to slip into her tone, some tremor of vindication, perhaps a hint of satisfaction at the reversal of roles. Nothing came. No triumphant chuckle. No dramatic flourish. Only composure. She asked for details. She wanted dates, deliverables, and scope. Her voice was cool, not cold, the voice of a professional accustomed to being underestimated, yet never unprepared. He attempted small talk, perhaps hoping to soften the past or frame it as a misunderstanding. She didn't entertain nostalgia, disguised as diplomacy. She didn't ask why he fired her. She didn't recount the humiliation. She didn't need to. Her restraint was proof of something he couldn't yet articulate. She had outgrown the need for acknowledgement. "I don't return to problems," she finally said. "I return to contracts." The word struck him harder than any accusation. They contained no anger, only structure. She was no longer the employee who accepted rushed deadlines or last-minute revisions. She was not negotiating from memory or emotion. She was negotiating from power, the one thing he believed she lacked when he dismissed her. He tried again, clumsily attempting to assert authority. "We can finalize paperwork later. The board needs confirmation today." She did not flinch. "Then the board will wait. I don't restore reputations without agreements in writing." She paused, ensuring the message landed. "This isn't a favor. It's a service." In that moment, he finally understood the difference between influence and importance. He had mistaken his title for leverage. She operated for merit, and merit ages differently than ego. Her abilities hadn't withered in her absence. They had matured. Meanwhile, his confidence, once inflated beyond reason, wrinkled under accountability. He asked her to come in for a preliminary meeting. She declined. If they wanted her perspective, they would formalize it first. If they wanted her design, they would pay for it. Her boundaries were not an act of revenge. They were the architecture of self-respect, assembled quietly over years of being overshadowed by someone who never earned the light he stood in. He ended the call drained, his authority reduced to a script that no longer impressed anyone. He anticipated closure when he fired her months earlier. Instead, he had opened the most painful chapter of his career, the chapter where consequences arrived disguised as invoices and where the people you dismissed returned not as employees, but as forces of nature. As she placed her phone down, there was no victory dance, no smile of triumph. She had not been waiting for his call. She had been building elsewhere, drafting futures that didn't include him. His crisis was not her burden, but the contract he now needed was hers to design. He thought firing her concluded the narrative. In truth, it barely scratched the introduction. He had removed her from his company. She had stepped into her destiny. Now the only blueprint that mattered was the one she would choose to draw, not for his redemption, but for her terms. The balance of power had shifted, and she hadn't lifted a single brick. The morning she re-entered the building felt like an eclipse. Familiar faces froze mid-step, conversations paused, and emails remained unsent as employees watched her cross the lobby with the calm assurance of someone who no longer needed permission to exist. She wasn't a returning employee seeking reinstatement. She was the consequence of a decision the CEO made without understanding its cost. Rumors spread instantly. Some whispered that she'd come to rescue the company. Others believed she had returned to dismantle it. No one could decide which possibility was more terrifying. Her appearance had changed. She no longer carried architectural tubes or folders under her arm. She carried a leather-bound portfolio, not of ideas waiting for approval, but of terms already ratified. The front desk didn't hand her a badge. She handed them paperwork signed by the board. Titles had shifted. Power had relocated. The woman once dismissed with a cardboard box now walked through security with authority that couldn't be revoked. The CEO emerged from his office, as if compelled by gravity. His nervous smile failed to hide what everyone else already sensed. The hierarchy had inverted. She didn't rush toward him or offer false pleasantries. She extended a document that contained conditions clear enough to be instructions carved in bedrock. She now operated as an external consultant with complete autonomy over architectural decisions. Her designs no longer required approval, they required implementation. When he reached the clause detailing her compensation, triple her former salary, his eyes widened. But he didn't argue. He didn't ask for justification. He simply signed, barely skimming the text. The pen trembled in his hand, not from fear of her, but fear of a future without her. He thought control came from holding the reins. He didn't realize the reins were always attached to her expertise. By midday, teams reorganized. Project heads reported directly to her. Meetings shifted to accommodate her schedule. Her presence created a new gravity. Even executives adjusted their tone when they spoke to her. She didn't demand respect. Her work had earned it long before anyone recognized its value. The CEO believed he was rehiring a savior. Instead, he had contracted accountability personified. And accountability doesn't negotiate with ego, it rewrites the rules. She didn't spend a second revisiting the decisions that had dragged the company to the brink. There was no emotional speech, no dramatic confrontation, and no passive-aggressive commentary. Her first act was surgical. She dismantled the flawed blueprint that had become the symbol of the company's downfall. The walls, the wiring, the materials, everything was reevaluated not by ego, but by expertise. What the board interpreted as confidence was, in truth, competence applied with precision. Within days, she restructured the workflow. Meetings became action sessions, not echo chambers. The glossy presentations the previous recruit loved to project were replaced with measurable milestones. She handpicked engineers who understood structural integrity and collaborated with vendors who delivered quality over trend-chasing aesthetics. Instead of outsourcing decisions to buzzwords, she restored architecture to its rightful place, a discipline governed by logic, mathematics, and vision, not slogans. Her redesign wasn't cosmetic. She corrected the angles of misaligned beams, resolved spatial inconsistencies, and ensured every layer of the complex was compliant with the strictest safety codes. What had once been a crisis now became a recalibrated challenge. Contractors, initially skeptical of another leadership shift, found themselves motivated by someone who understood their language. For the first time in years, questions received answers instead of excuses. Progress accelerated. Construction, once paralyzed by revisions and delays, began advancing ahead of schedule. Reports that once read like cautionary tales transformed into performance summaries filled with green indicators. The project's exterior took shape, showcasing the elegance that had always defined her work, a balance between innovation and permanence. Investors noticed. Board members who once lost sleep over potential litigation now fought for seats at project briefings. Clients who had paused future contracts returned, eager to be associated with a firm that had rediscovered its identity. The company's name, previously whispered with skepticism in trade circles, reappeared on lists celebrating architectural excellence. Industry publications highlighted the turnaround, not as a miracle, but as a restoration of standards. She never asked for applause. The buildings spoke for her. Structures cannot fabricate truth. They either endure or reveal failure. And her design, crafted with discipline rather than ego, stood tall against scrutiny and time. In the end, she didn't just save the company. She reminded everyone that architecture is not decoration. It is consequence. Her blueprint didn't restore a brand. It resurrected integrity. The company's revival should have been his moment of triumph. He expected applause, headlines, and recognition for steering the ship back to prosperity. Instead, what greeted him was an unnerving quiet, a silence that didn't praise, didn't question, didn't need him. The board no longer deferred to his opinions, they deferred to her results. Meetings he once dominated now moved along without his input, because the answers everyone needed came from her plans, not his presence. His office, once the nucleus of the company's decisions, became a decorative space where he sat watching progress he couldn't claim. He began noticing details he had ignored before. Every investor returning to the negotiation table referenced her redesign. Journalists interviewing the company focused on architectural innovation, not executive strategy. His name was absent from conversations that once revolved around him. Even the staff he once lectured now walked past his door with a calm confidence that didn't require his approval. He remained in the same office, but his role had evaporated, leaving him with the hollow weight of a title stripped of relevance. It was during a board presentation that the truth settled in. The slideshow displayed the company's flagship projects, the ones earning awards, the ones attracting new contracts, the ones restoring credibility. Each design bore elements unmistakably hers: the elegant curvatures, the meticulous structure, the seamless integration of beauty and logic. He watched as the board analyzed her plans line by line, while his contributions were reduced to polite acknowledgments. He was no longer a leader. He was a spectator of her legacy. The epiphany did not arrive like lightning. It seeped in like water through cracked concrete. He hadn't built an empire. He had merely occupied the office closest to it. She was the architect of the company's identity, the mind that turned sketches into skylines. Her departure hadn't just hurt the business. It exposed how dependent it had always been on her brilliance. He didn't lose control when she left. He lost the illusion that he ever had any. For years, he believed success came from ownership, titles, authority, the ability to hire and fire. Now, he understood something far more expensive: the true cost of losing talent. Empires don't crumble because competitors are stronger. They collapse because the people who hold them together are pushed away. He didn't fire an employee. He dismissed the foundation his empire stood on. Leadership, he once believed, was about authority, the power to command, dismiss, and reshape organizations according to personal vision. He now understood how flawed that belief was. The day he fired her, he assumed he was demonstrating control. To him, talent was interchangeable, a line item on payroll that could be subtracted without consequence. But structures don't collapse in an instant. They tilt slowly, creak quietly, then fall loudly. His downfall began the moment she walked out with her dignity intact and his ignorance boxed inside that cardboard container he had so proudly handed her. Rehiring her was not an act of strategy, it was an act of surrender. He didn't reach out because he valued her, he reached out because he had run out of options. The board wasn't interested in his explanations. Investors ignored his polished statements. His speeches no longer disguised the cracks in the company's foundation. The only blueprint capable of saving him was the one he discarded. When she returned, it wasn't as an employee, but as the embodiment of competence he could no longer deny. She never gloated. She never sought revenge. She didn't rewrite company history or demand apologies. Her silence was not weakness, it was victory. She let reality speak on her behalf. Every project she completed, every award the company received, every client who returned was a reminder that talent is not a commodity. It is the cornerstone of every legacy worth remembering. The CEO watched her success unfold, not from the throne he once imagined, but from the margins where obsolete leaders sit when their illusions fade. He wasn't ruined by her actions. He was ruined by his refusal to see her value when it mattered. Humiliation wasn't her weapon. Arrogance was his. She merely moved forward, and in doing so, left him behind. Now, every building shaped by her vision stands as a monument to the lesson he learned too late. Positions can be granted, but mastery must be earned. Titles may impress the uninformed, but skylines tell the truth. They don't honor CEOs. They honor architects. And somewhere in those walls, beneath the steel and concrete, echoes the warning future leaders ignore at their peril. Never underestimate the person who builds what you only dream of owning.